Welcome to Hanging in My Tree with Frederick Henry Sharman and Ellen or Helen Sharman, previously Farquhar. Helen and Frederick were my second great-grandparents and lived their whole lives in Tasmania, although their children scattered around Australia and New Zealand. They lived a simple life of home duties, labouring, particularly timber work, mining and farming. They were well-respected members of their community. Like all families, there were some skeletons in their closet. Helen having had an illegitimate child when she was 17, and her son leaving Tasmania after his own child was born out of wedlock. So where do they sit in the family tree? Frederick was the son of Edward Albert Sharman and Ernestine Christina Hanch, and the grandson of John Sharman, Mary Edis, John Ellington, Anna Breeze, Ernest Hanch, Christina Nobish. Going back further, names like Harlock, Campion, Weston, Rawlings appear in the tree. Helen was the daughter of Alexander Farquhar and Jane Dougal, and the granddaughter of David Farquhar, Sarah Dunn, Thomas Dougal, Helen Fofar. Going further back, surnames like Wilson, Niven, Ballantyne, Wilson, Tower, Sharp, Galloway, Ray and Irving appear in Helen's tree. Frederick and Helen had 3 children together. Laura Sharman, who married Cecil Lang, Frederick Mervyn Sharman, who changed his name to Frederick Maxwell and married Lillian O'Keefe, and Isabella Merle Sharman, who died at 8 weeks of age. Helen also had a daughter, Lena May Farquhar, who married William Mercrow. The descendants of Laura Lang and Frederick Maxwell include names like Lang, Moffat, Woods, Hayes, Rudens, Moore, McGuinness, Maxwell and Skur. Frederick was reportedly born on 7 November 1894 at New Norfolk, Tasmania. I've not been able to find any documents that confirm his birth. He was born to Edward Albert Sharman and Ernestine Christina Sharman, who were both immigrants, Albert from home Huntingdonshire, London, and Christina from Brandenburg, Prussia, whose families both moved to Tasmania. The only confirmation that I could find that his father was Edmund Sharman was his wedding notice dated the 30th of January 1891, stating that he was the eldest son of Edward Sharman of Dunlorian. Helen was born Ellen Farquhar to Alexander Farquhar and Jane Dougal, who we've met in earlier Hanging in My Tree videos, on the 25th of March 1869 in the district of Ringarooma, Tasmania. Her birth entry confirms that her father was a farmer and that the family resided in Scottsdale. Alexander and Jane were immigrants from Scotland. Both Frederick and Helen came from large families in the north of Tasmania. I won't go into detail about life in northern Tasmania in the 1860s. A number of the other Hanging in My Tree videos have explored this in detail, including the videos about Jane Alexander Farquhar, Elena and William Mercrow, and George and Mary Sharman. But it was a wild life. Helen and Frederick were not settlers themselves, but the children of the initial European settlers. They would have grown up with no electricity, no running water, no general stores, and very little infrastructure. We know from birth records that Helen had a daughter, Elena or Lena May Farquhar, out of wedlock when she was 17 years of age. The father of Lena was not identified, and Helen's mother, Jane Farquhar, adopted Lena as if she were her own child. You can find out more about Lena's life in the Hanging in My Tree video about Lena and William Mercrow. Helen and Frederick were married at Jetsonville at the home of her mother, Mrs. Alexander Farquhar, on 28 January 1891. At that stage, Helen's name was recorded with a double L. Frederick was 26 years and Helen was 21. Frederick's occupation was a labourer and neither had been married before. They were married under the rite of the Free Church of Scotland. The witnesses to the wedding were Helen's siblings, Thomas Dougal Farquhar, Elizabeth Farquhar and Albert Farquhar, and Frederick's sister, Elizabeth May Sharman. The couple's first child Laura Alberta Sharman, my great-grandmother, was born on 3 March 1892. The birth records confirm that Frederick was still a labourer and the couple was living in Scottsdale, Tasmania. 11 months later, their son, Frederick Mervyn Sharman, was born on 1 February 1894. Frederick's occupation is now recorded as a farmer and the family remain living in Scottsdale. I only know of the one photograph of Frederick and Helen, and that's a photograph of them with their son, Frederick, when he appeared to be under the age of 10 years. On 28 December 1898, their second daughter, Isabella Merle Sharman, was born. At the time, Frederick's occupation was a labourer and the family were living in Scottsdale. Unfortunately, Isabella died at 8 weeks of age on 18 February 1899 of convulsions. She is buried at Scottsdale and Ellesmere General Cemetery. Frederick's occupation was listed as a miner in this document. By 1914, we have an electoral roll which shows the couple were living in George Street, Scottsdale. Helen's occupation was domestic duties. Frederick was a miner and their daughter Laura was living with them at home and was a bookkeeper. The family home was at 205 George Street, Scottsdale. That address no longer exists. Scottsdale, originally called Ellesmere, is in the northern eastern tip of Tasmania, 60 kilometres northeast of Launceston. Scottsdale is between Launceston and Bridpoint on the coast and Lilydale and Ringarooma. Scottsdale remains an agricultural hub and is the largest town between Launceston and Hobart. There was an article on the 3rd of December 1929 that said a Frederick Sharman of Scottsdale was undergoing treatment at Launceston Hospital. On 13 April 1930, Frederick died at Scottsdale, Tasmania, aged 65 years of age. He was buried at Scottsdale and Ellesmere General Cemetery. An article about his death said, "Following a long and distressing illness extending over several months with practically no hope of recovery, Mr. Frederick Henry Sharman passed away on Sunday morning at his residence in Scottsdale at the age of 65 years. The deceased was of a quiet, retiring nature and commanded the respect and esteem of all with whom he came in contact. He has resided in Scottsdale for over 40 years and during the most of that period followed sawmilling and mining pursuits. He leaves a widow and a family of 2, a son and a daughter, Mr. Frederick Sharman, New Zealand, and Mrs. Lang, New South Wales. The burial took place yesterday afternoon at the Ellesmere Cemetery, and the service at the graveside being conducted by Reverend Drennan, who just arrived at Scottsdale to take over the Presbyterian charge. Robert Alexander Farquhar, who was the son of Helen's brother David Alexander Farquhar, wrote a history of the Farquhars in Scottsdale, Tasmania, and said about Frederick and Helen, Helen, Nell, married Fred Sharman from Huon. He was a one-time champion axeman who followed up timber work mainly through his life. He was an expert bushman, therefore his services were sought for by timber mills. I did try to find confirmation that Frederick was a champion axeman. There is an article from 1896 of an athletic sports carnival at Lilydale, which is 40 kilometres away from Scottsdale. People had travelled from as far as Launceston and the northern districts, and F.H. Sharman competed and came third in a chopping match. There is an article in the Northern Eastern Advertiser of an athletics carnival in Scottsdale, where the family lived. In 1919, that Frederick Sharman, then regarded as the best man on the coast and was only beaten by a couple of blows. It should be noted that an F. Sharman of Weegina won the biggest event in wood cutting on the President's Cup in Deloraine. This occurred after Frederick's death, so there is another F. Sharman who was an award-winning axeman. That's not to say that our Frederick was an award-winning axeman as well, but I can't prove it from any of the documents. Helen continued living at George Street, Scottsdale, where she died on the 28th of May, 1944, just reaching 75 years of age. She was also buried at Scottsdale and Ellesmere General Cemetery. There is an obituary for Helen which states that after gradually falling during the past 12 months, her death occurred at Scottsdale on Tuesday morning. It states that she was of a quiet and pleasant nature, and having resided in the district all of her life, made many friends. She was an earnest and staunch supporter of the Presbyterian Church, and for many years took an active interest in church work. The burial took place on Wednesday afternoon, and the Presbyterian minister officiated at the graveside. The chief mourners were her 3 brothers, Thomas, Jack and Albert Farquhar, and her brother-in-law William Watts of Launceston. This was Frederick's sister Elizabeth May's husband. Helen's death notice states that she was the mother of Laura Lang, who was living in New South Wales, Fred, who was living in New Zealand, and the sister of Tom, Jack, Albert, Belle, and Lena. In Lena's video, I wondered if Lena was ever told that Helen was her mother. Publicly, Lena was always referred to as Helen's sister. But in Helen's will dated the 8th of May 1939, Helen gave her estate to her 3 living children: Laura, who had married Cecil Lang and was living in New South Wales, Australia; Frederick Mervyn Sharman, who was a butcher living in Taupoki, New Zealand; and Lena May Mercrow, who was living in Alston, Victoria, Australia. So clearly, at least by the time of her death, Lena would have known the identity of her mother. It was very sad that, given that she was buried so quickly after her death, that none of her children who lived in different states or countries were able to attend her funeral. Thank you for watching this episode of Hanging in My Tree with Ellen and Frederick Sharman. This video was made for family history purposes, so contains direct quotes and information from the internet.